Theodore Robert Bundy wore the mask of charm like a perfectly fitted suit. Law student, crisis hotline volunteer, political campaign worker, the kind of man mothers hoped their daughters would bring home. But beneath that winning smile lurked something monstrous. A predator who would confess to 30 murders across 7 states, though investigators believe the true number climbed much higher. His killing spree stretched from 1974 to 1978, leaving a trail of young women who simply vanished. College campuses became hunting grounds. Bundy perfected the art of deception, using fake casts and crutches to appear helpless, luring victims to isolated locations where their screams would never be heard. He was methodical, intelligent, and utterly without remorse. The electric chair finally claimed him on January 24, 1989 at Florida State Prison. Outside, crowds gathered with signs reading, "Burn Bundy, burn," and "Tuesday is Friday." His body was cremated immediately afterward. His ashes scattered in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State. But his grave holds a secret that even his victims' families don't know. The exact location remains hidden, protected by laws designed to prevent his final resting place from becoming a twisted shrine for admirers who still write him love letters decades after his death. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer earned a nickname that still makes people shudder: the Milwaukee Cannibal. Between 1978 and 1991, he murdered 17 young men and boys, most of them minorities, he lured from gay bars and bus stops. His apartment became a house of horrors where he drugged, killed, and dismembered his victims, keeping body parts as grotesque trophies. The world learned the full extent of his depravity when police discovered severed heads in his refrigerator, skulls painted and arranged like decorations, and photographs documenting his crimes in sickening detail. Dahmer didn't just kill, he consumed his victims, claiming he wanted them to become part of him forever. The smell of death hung so thick in his apartment that neighbors complained for months before anyone investigated. Prison justice found him on November 28, 1994, when fellow inmate Christopher Scarver beat him to death with a metal bar in the gymnasium. But what happened to his remains would shock even hardened investigators. His parents fought bitterly over his body, his mother wanting him cremated, his father demanding burial. The court ordered cremation, but the family's public battle revealed something darker. His brain had been preserved for scientific study, sitting in a laboratory jar for months before finally being incinerated, ensuring no part of the monster could ever become a macabre relic. John Wayne Gacy lived 2 lives with terrifying precision. By day, he was a successful construction contractor and Democratic Party volunteer who entertained children at hospitals as Pogo the Clown. By night, he prowled Chicago's streets hunting for victims, young men and boys he would lure to his suburban home with promises of work or money. What happened in that house would make it one of America's most notorious crime scenes. Between 1968 and 1978, Gacy murdered at least 33 people, burying 26 bodies in his crawl space and yard. The stench became so overwhelming that he told neighbors it was from a broken sewer pipe. When police finally excavated his property in December 1978, they found layer upon layer of decomposed remains, some buried so close together they had to be separated with dental records. The state of Illinois executed him by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. His final meal was fried shrimp, Kentucky Fried Chicken, French fries, and strawberries. But his final wish was denied. But what replaced it was far worse. Gacy wanted to be buried in a Catholic cemetery, but church officials refused, forcing his family to cremate him instead. His ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location, but rumors persist that family members secretly kept portions, creating multiple grave sites that may never be found. Edward Theodore Gein was just a quiet farmer living alone in the Wisconsin countryside, or so his neighbors believed. But when police entered his farmhouse on November 16, 1957, they discovered a chamber of horrors that would inspire Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. His modest home had become a workshop for the unthinkable. The inventory of horror seemed endless. Lampshades made from human faces, bowls crafted from skulls, a belt decorated with female body parts, and furniture upholstered with human skin. Gein had been grave robbing for years. exhuming recently buried middle-aged women who resembled his deceased mother. He confessed to murdering only 2 people, but the evidence suggested his crimes ran much deeper into depravity and necrophilia. Gein died in the Mendota Mental Health Institute on July 26, 1984, after spending nearly 3 decades in psychiatric care. His family buried him in Plainfield Cemetery, next to his beloved mother Augusta, under a simple granite headstone bearing just his name and dates. But visitors still leave disturbing tributes at his headstone. The grave has been vandalized countless times by souvenir hunters who chip away pieces of the stone, while others leave bizarre offerings like women's clothing and handmade masks, turning his final resting place into a shrine for those fascinated by his twisted legacy. Charles Miles Manson never pulled a trigger or wielded a knife during the infamous murders that made him America's most notorious cult leader. Instead, he used something far more dangerous: his voice. With hypnotic charisma and twisted philosophy, he convinced his followers that killing innocent people would spark a race war he called Helter Skelter, named after a Beatles song he believed contained coded messages meant for him. The Manson family's killing spree reached its horrific peak over 2 nights in August 1969. On August 9th, they slaughtered 5 people at Sharon Tate's Benedict Canyon home, including the pregnant actress herself. The next night, they murdered Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in their Los Feliz home, writing messages in blood on the walls. The randomness of the victims and the savagery of the crimes terrorized Los Angeles and ended the age of Aquarius. Manson died of natural causes in prison on November 19, 2017, but 3 different people claimed his corpse, but only one got their way. His grandson, Jason Freeman, battled Manson's pen pal Michael Channels and a man claiming to be his son for control of the body. The legal fight lasted months, while Manson remained in cold storage. Freeman eventually won, cremating the cult leader and scattering his ashes on private property. The location kept secret to prevent his grave from becoming a pilgrimage site for admirers who still worship his twisted legacy. Aileen Carol Wuornos claimed she killed in self-defense, but 7 dead men along Florida's highways told a different story. Between 1989 and 1990, she shot her victims at close range after picking them up while working as a prostitute. Each man was found in or near his vehicle. Wallet missing, life stolen by a woman. The media would sensationally dub America's first female serial killer. Her childhood reads like a blueprint for violence. Abandoned by her mother, raised by abusive grandparents, pregnant at 14 from assault by a family friend. She lived rough, sleeping in cars and abandoned buildings, surviving through theft and prostitution. When she met Tyria Moore at a gay bar in 1986, Wuornos thought she had found love, but their relationship would ultimately lead to her capture when Moore cooperated with police. Florida executed her by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, after she spent over a decade on death row giving bizarre interviews, claiming she was being tortured by prison guards with sonic weapons. She donated her body to science, but when no institution would accept the remains of a serial killer, she was cremated instead. Her grave marker tells only half the story of her violent end. The ashes were given to her childhood friend Dawn Botkins, who scattered them beneath a tree in her native Michigan, but Botkins later revealed that Wuornos had begged her to spread the ashes in the ocean so she could finally be free, a final wish that was never granted. Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez prowled the streets of Los Angeles like a demon in human form, earning the nickname that would haunt Southern California throughout 1985, the Night Stalker. He slipped through unlocked windows and doors in the dead of night, bringing terror to sleeping families across the city. His victims ranged from children to elderly couples, united only by their misfortune of crossing his path. The randomness of his attacks paralyzed Los Angeles. He used guns, knives, hammers, whatever weapon suited his twisted mood. He carved pentagrams into victims' bodies and forced survivors to swear allegiance to Satan. During his trial, he flashed a pentagram drawn on his palm and declared, "Hail Satan," showing no remorse for the 13 murders and countless sexual assaults that made him one of California's most feared predators. Death row claimed him before the state could execute him. He died of complications from B-cell lymphoma on June 7, 2013, at Marin General Hospital while awaiting execution at San Quentin. His body was transported back to his hometown of El Paso, Texas, where family members held a private burial. But his grave location was hidden for a reason that terrified authorities. Police feared that revealing the cemetery would attract both admirers who romanticized his crimes and vigilantes seeking to desecrate his remains, so they sealed all records and threatened prosecution for anyone who disclosed the burial site. Hamilton Howard Fish appeared to be a harmless grandfather, a frail old man with kind eyes who worked as a house painter and raised 6 children as a single father. But behind his gentle facade lurked one of America's most depraved predators, a man who claimed to have molested over 400 children and murdered at least 5. He called himself the Gray Man, and parents across the Northeast whispered warnings about the stranger who stole children from their beds. His most notorious crime involved 10-year-old Grace Budd, whom he lured from her family's Manhattan apartment in 1928 under the pretense of taking her to a birthday party. Instead, he brought her to an abandoned house in Westchester County, where he strangled her and consumed parts of her body over 9 days. 6 years later, he sent a letter to her parents describing the murder in horrific detail, leading to his capture and conviction. New York executed him in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison on January 16, 1936. Fish reportedly looked forward to his execution, calling it the supreme thrill of his life. Prison officials buried him in the prison cemetery, but his burial location was lost on purpose, but someone recently found it. In 2021, genealogy researchers using old prison records and ground-penetrating radar located his unmarked grave in Sing Sing's forgotten cemetery, reigniting debates about whether monsters like Fish deserve to rest in peace or should remain lost to history forever. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo walked among the Soviet Union's citizens as a respected teacher, father, and Communist Party member, but he harbored an appetite for violence that would earn him the title of the most prolific serial killer in Russian history. Between 1978 and 1990, he murdered at least 52 people, though investigators believe the true number exceeded 100 victims across the vast Soviet landscape. He hunted primarily around train stations and bus stops, targeting runaways, prostitutes, and homeless individuals who wouldn't be immediately missed by authorities, already overwhelmed by the chaos of a crumbling empire. Chikatilo would lure victims to secluded forest areas where he would stab them repeatedly, often consuming parts of their bodies in cannibalistic frenzies. His crimes were so savage that Soviet officials initially blamed them on mentally ill patients, refusing to acknowledge that a serial killer could exist in their supposedly perfect socialist society. The KGB finally captured him in 1990 after a massive manhunt that involved analyzing thousands of blood samples and monitoring train stations across 11 Soviet republics. A firing squad executed him with a single bullet to the head on February 14, 1994, at a prison in Novocherkassk. The Russian government buried him in a place that officially doesn't exist. Prison records list his burial location as classified, and former KGB agents claim his body was interred in an unmarked grave within a restricted military zone that appears on no public maps, ensuring his resting place would remain hidden from the families of victims who might seek closure or revenge. Harold Frederick Shipman earned the trust of patients across Greater Manchester as their beloved family doctor, a bearded physician who made house calls and seemed genuinely concerned about his elderly patients' welfare. But behind his caring bedside manner lurked Britain's most prolific serial killer, a man who used his medical expertise to murder at least 218 people, though investigators believe the true number may exceed 400 victims over his 23-year career. His method was deceptively simple and terrifyingly effective. He would visit elderly patients in their homes, often alone and vulnerable, then inject them with lethal doses of diamorphine, commonly known as medical heroin. The victims would slip into peaceful unconsciousness, appearing to die naturally from age-related complications. Shipman would then falsify death certificates, listing heart failure or other natural causes, allowing him to kill with impunity for decades, while families thanked him for easing their loved ones' final moments. His downfall came when he attempted to forge the will of his final victim, 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy, naming himself as the beneficiary of her estate. Her daughter, a lawyer, became suspicious and demanded an autopsy that revealed lethal levels of diamorphine. He was convicted in 2000 and sentenced to life imprisonment, but he died by self-inflicted harm in his cell on January 13, 2004, using bedsheets. His ashes were scattered in secret, but someone photographed the location. A prison chaplain later revealed that Shipman's ashes were scattered in the Peak District, but refused to disclose the exact spot, fearing it would become a macabre tourist destination for those fascinated by his unprecedented betrayal of the doctor-patient relationship. Pedro Alonso Lopez may be the most prolific serial killer in recorded history, yet his name remains virtually unknown to most of the world. The monster of the Andes claimed to have murdered over 300 young girls across Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador during the 1970s and early 80s, though he was convicted for only a fraction of these crimes. His victims were street children and indigenous girls from remote villages, people's society had already forgotten. Lopez perfected his horrific craft by targeting the most vulnerable members of society. He would approach markets and bus stations where homeless children gathered, offering them food or small amounts of money before leading them to isolated areas. He preferred victims between 8 and 12 years old, claiming they were easier to control and less likely to fight back. When questioned about his methods, he showed no remorse, describing his crimes with chilling detachment as if discussing a business transaction. Ecuadorian authorities arrested him in 1980 after a failed abduction attempt, but he served barely 14 years in prison before being released in 1994 and immediately deported to Colombia. Since then, he has vanished without a trace, and no one knows if he's dead or alive, but locals claim they've seen his grave. Villagers in remote areas of Colombia report finding unmarked graves containing the remains of young girls, and some whisper that Lopez died years ago, buried in an anonymous plot somewhere in the Andean foothills. Though no official record of his death exists, leaving the possibility that one of history's most dangerous predators may still be alive. Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth arrived in America from Norway with dreams of prosperity, but she would become known as Belle Gunness, one of history's most cunning black widows. From her farm in LaPorte, Indiana, she orchestrated a murder scheme that may have claimed over 40 victims between 1884 and 1908. Her weapon of choice wasn't poison or a gun, but rather newspaper advertisements that promised lonely men love, marriage, and a comfortable life on her prosperous farm. Belle's personal ads appeared in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest, seeking husbands who could bring cash to invest in her farming operation. Suitors would arrive by train with their life savings, eager to meet the woman who promised them happiness and security. Instead, they found death, usually from blunt force trauma or strychnine poisoning. She would bury their bodies around her property and keep their money, then place new advertisements to lure the next victim to her farm of horrors. Her killing spree ended abruptly on April 28, 1908, when her farmhouse mysteriously burned to the ground. Investigators found the bodies of her 3 children and a headless adult female corpse, initially identified as Belle herself. But the body in her grave wasn't hers, and the real Belle was never found. The headless corpse was too small to be Belle, who stood nearly 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. Dental evidence later confirmed the body belonged to another victim, while Belle Gunness had vanished with her fortune, leaving behind a fake grave and dozens of unmarked burial sites scattered across her former property. Her true fate remaining one of America's greatest criminal mysteries. Herman Webster Mudgett reinvented himself as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes and built what newspapers would sensationally call America's first murder castle. During the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, his 3-story hotel at 63rd and Wallace Streets became a death trap designed with the precision of an architect and the mind of a psychopath. The building featured soundproof rooms, gas pipes leading into guest quarters, chutes that dropped bodies to the basement, and a crematorium to dispose of evidence. Holmes lured victims with charm and promises of employment at his hotel, targeting young women who had come to Chicago seeking work at the World's Fair. Some were employees, others were guests, who checked in but never checked out. He would gas them in their rooms, then drop their bodies through hidden chutes to his basement laboratory, where he would dissect them and sell their skeletons to medical schools. Investigators believe he murdered between 20 and 200 people, though he confessed to only 27 killings. The state of Pennsylvania executed him by hanging on May 7, 1896, for the murder of his business partner, Benjamin Pitezel. But he demanded his coffin be sealed in concrete, fearing someone would disturb his rest. Holmes had spent his life manipulating and deceiving others, so his final paranoid request seemed fitting for a man who trusted no one. His family honored his bizarre wish, encasing his coffin in 2 feet of concrete before burial at Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania, creating a fortress around his remains that remains intact over a century later, as if even in death he feared the victims he had wronged might somehow reach him. Israel Keyes was methodical in ways that terrified law enforcement across the nation. Unlike other serial killers who operated in familiar territory, he traveled thousands of miles to hunt victims in random locations, burying murder kits containing weapons, cash, and tools, years before he planned to use them. Between 2000 and 2012, he killed at least 3 people, though FBI profilers believe the true number reached into the dozens across multiple states and countries. His most documented crime involved 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, a barista he kidnapped from her coffee stand in Anchorage, Alaska on February 1, 2012. He held her captive for hours before strangling her, then kept her body frozen for weeks while he traveled out of state. Upon returning, he posed her corpse for a ransom photo, sewing her eyes open to make her appear alive, then dismembered her remains and threw them in a frozen lake. The FBI arrested him in March 2012 after tracing bank withdrawals he made using Koenig's stolen debit card. While awaiting trial, he died by self-inflicted harm in his cell on December 2, 2012, using a bedsheet and a pen to cut his wrists. But his family buried him in their family plot, sparking community outrage. Despite fierce opposition from Anchorage residents who wanted him cremated and forgotten, his relatives transported his body to the Deer Park Cemetery in Deer Park, Washington, where they held a private burial among other family members, a decision that angered victim advocacy groups who felt a killer so calculating and remorseless deserved no peaceful resting place alongside innocent relatives. Arthur John Shawcross emerged from prison in 1987 after serving 15 years for the murder of 2 children, a release that would prove catastrophic for the women of Rochester, New York. Within 2 years of his parole, he had begun a new killing spree targeting prostitutes along the Genesee River, earning him the nickname that would follow him to his grave, the Genesee River Killer. Between 1988 and 1989, he murdered 11 women, dumping their bodies near waterways with the casual indifference of someone disposing of trash. His victims were vulnerable women working the streets of Rochester, many struggling with addiction or homelessness. Shawcross would pick them up under the pretense of paying for services, then strangle or beat them to death before disposing of their bodies in remote locations along the Genesee River and its tributaries. He showed no remorse during interrogations, describing the murders in clinical detail and claiming the women deserved their fate for the lives they led. Police caught him in January 1990 when they spotted him masturbating in his car near a bridge where one of his victims had been found. He was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life in prison, where he died of cardiac arrest on November 10, 2008, at age 63. But his own family refused his body, leaving the state to decide his fate. Prison officials held his remains for months while searching for any relative willing to claim him, but his children and surviving family members all declined, forcing New York State to arrange for his cremation and disposal through the county coroner's office, his ashes scattered in an undisclosed location with no ceremony or mourners, to mark the passing of a man even his own blood had abandoned. Robert Christian Hansen turned the pristine wilderness of Alaska into his personal hunting ground, but his prey wasn't caribou or moose, it was human beings. The Butcher Baker, as he became known, operated out of Anchorage from 1971 to 1983, kidnapping women and flying them to remote cabins in his small aircraft. There he would release them into the wilderness and hunt them like animals, armed with a hunting rifle, while his victims ran barefoot through the frozen landscape. Hansen appeared to be an ordinary businessman who owned a successful bakery and lived quietly with his wife and children. But his mild exterior concealed a monster who had turned murder into a twisted sporting event. He would abduct women, usually prostitutes or dancers from downtown Anchorage, then transport them by plane to isolated areas where no one would hear their screams. He gave some victims a head start before pursuing them through the woods, treating their terror and desperation as entertainment. Alaska state troopers arrested him in 1983 after survivor Cindy Paulson escaped and provided detailed testimony about his methods and remote cabin locations. Hansen confessed to killing 17 women, though investigators believe the actual number exceeded 30 victims scattered across Alaska's vast wilderness. He died of natural causes in prison on August 21, 2014, while serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. They buried him just miles from where he hunted his victims. His family laid him to rest in Anchorage Memorial Park Cemetery, a decision that horrified many locals who felt his grave desecrated the same landscape where he had terrorized and murdered so many innocent women. His headstone, now a permanent reminder of evil, in a place that should represent peace. Dean Arnold Corll earned his nickname through an act of twisted generosity, handing out free candy to neighborhood children from his family's confectionery business in Houston, Texas. But the Candyman's kindness was a carefully crafted facade that concealed one of America's most horrific killing sprees. Between 1970 and 1973, he tortured and murdered at least 28 young men and boys, though investigators believe the true number may have exceeded 40 victims across the Houston area. Corll recruited two teenage accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, to lure victims to his various apartments and rental houses. The boys would bring friends and acquaintances with promises of parties, drugs, or simply a place to hang out. Once inside, Corll would drug his victims, then bind them to a specially constructed torture board where he would assault and kill them over periods of hours or sometimes days. He buried most bodies at remote locations, including a boat shed in southwest Houston that became known as one of the largest crime scenes in American history. His reign of terror ended on August 8, 1973, when accomplice Elmer Wayne Henley shot him 6 times during a dispute. Police discovered the full scope of his crimes when Henley led them to the burial sites, where they unearthed body after body in a discovery that shocked the nation. But his mother moved his body 3 times, each burial more secret than the last. Mary Corll initially buried her son at Forest Park Lawndale Cemetery, but after the headstone was repeatedly vandalized and the grave became a target for angry protesters, she quietly moved his remains to an unmarked plot in Forest Park East Cemetery, then later to a third location that she never revealed to anyone, taking the secret of his final resting place to her own grave. William George Bonin terrorized Southern California's sprawling freeway system during the late 1970s and early 1980s, earning the chilling moniker of the Freeway Killer. He cruised the highways in his van, hunting for teenage hitchhikers and runaways who would never make it to their destinations. Between 1979 and 1980, he tortured and murdered at least 14 young men and boys, dumping their bodies alongside California's busy freeways like discarded refuse. Bonin's method was as calculated as it was cruel. He would offer rides to vulnerable teenagers, often those fleeing troubled homes or simply trying to get across the sprawling Los Angeles metropolitan area. Once inside his van, equipped with restraints and weapons, his victims faced hours of unthinkable torture before he strangled them or beat them to death. He frequently recruited accomplices to help with the abductions, turning murder into a twisted group activity that bonded the participants through shared violence. Police finally arrested him in June 1980, after a witness spotted him assaulting a victim in his van and recorded his license plate number. California executed him by lethal injection on February 23, 1996, making him the first person executed in California since 1967. But when no family claimed his body, the state made a decision that shocked everyone. Prison officials had expected his relatives to arrange burial, but when his family refused all contact and declined to take responsibility for his remains, California cremated him at state expense and scattered his ashes in the Pacific Ocean without ceremony, treating one of their most notorious killers like anonymous medical waste rather than giving him any semblance of a dignified resting place. Edmund Emil Kemper III stands 6 feet 9 inches tall and possesses an IQ of 136, making him one of the most intelligent and physically imposing serial killers in American history. The co-ed killer as he became known, murdered 10 people between 1964 and 1973, including his own grandparents and mother. But what makes Kemper truly terrifying isn't just his crimes. It's his chilling self-awareness and the fact that he's still alive in prison, calmly discussing his murders with the same analytical detachment most people reserve for discussing the weather. His killing spree began when he was just 15 years old, shooting both grandparents at their remote California ranch because, as he later explained, he wanted to see what it felt like to kill his grandmother and didn't want to leave his grandfather as a witness. After 6 years in a psychiatric facility, he was released and began targeting college co-eds around the University of California, Santa Cruz, picking up hitchhikers whom he would murder, dismember, and assault post-mortem. His final victim was his own mother, whom he bludgeoned to death with a hammer before decapitating her and using her head for unspeakable acts. What sets Kemper apart from other killers is his disturbing cooperation with law enforcement and his apparent genuine remorse. Though whether this remorse is real or another manipulation remains hotly debated among psychologists. Now 75 years old and serving life without parole at California Medical Facility in Vacaville, he has become a model prisoner who records audiobooks for the blind and provides insights to FBI profilers studying serial killer psychology. He's planned his own funeral in disturbing detail, and the location will horrify you. Kemper has reportedly told prison officials he wants to be cremated and his ashes scattered in the Santa Cruz Mountains where he committed many of his murders, claiming he wants to return to the place where he felt most powerful, a final act of narcissism that would allow him to symbolically possess his hunting grounds for eternity. In the end, every story returns to the earth, carved into stone or lost to the soil, but never forgotten. These 22 graves tell us something profound about how society grapples with evil, how we struggle to balance justice with dignity, remembrance with erasure. Some killers rest in marked graves that become unwanted shrines, others lie in secret plots, and still others have been scattered to the winds. The question that haunts every cemetery visitor, every family member, every survivor, is simple yet impossible to answer. Did they deserve these fates? Some received burials from families who couldn't separate love from horror. Others were abandoned by relatives who wanted nothing to do with their legacy of violence. Some were cremated and scattered in secret, while others were buried in concrete fortresses, as if even in death they posed a threat. Death, the great equalizer, cannot undo the evil these individuals committed in life. Their graves may be hidden, unmarked, or destroyed, but the pain they inflicted echoes through generations, permanent as any headstone. In death, as in life, they remain reminders that evil exists, that it walks among us, wearing human faces, and that sometimes the only justice lies in ensuring they're never forgotten.